Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Thanks for joining our Modern Workplace Transformation with Microsoft 365 webinar, Episode 2 Identity. Before we start, we'd like to go over some housekeeping notes. We do enjoy hearing questions, so please use the question icon to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to answer them during the session. Additionally, we will have some poll questions throughout the session, so please feel free to respond as you see this open in the poll section. With that in mind, I will pass it over to Jeff Lisserbrom, Solution Architect for our Microsoft 365 Productivity team.
Well, thank you, Diego. I am very happy to be here. Again, my name is Jeff Lizerbaum. I am a productivity solutions architect here at Rackspace Technology. And in today's presentation, we're going to be covering modern workplace transformation with Microsoft 365, Episode 2, and this is going to be focusing on identity. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. What we'll be covering today is, first off, we're going to start with a recap of what we discussed in episode 1. Then we're going to go right into that first workload of modern workplace transformation, which is really identity. We'll go into the types of synchronization models, and one of my favorite topics is covering single sign-on. With single sign-on, there is authentication methods and especially protecting those identities in the modern workplace. So we're going to be covering the whole identity platform of moving to modern workplace here. What we talked about in the first episode, my colleague Josh Tarbox covered what was known as a historically common infrastructure, and that is namely Active Directory. There are lots of organizations, and you might be one of them that is running your own Active Directory environment, either large or small. Some are involving lots of domain controllers within the infrastructure. Some might just be running on a small business server still to this day. Now, the thing with Active Directory, this was a great solution for its time. 23 years in the making, it's still, considered a pretty solid infrastructure, but it's starting to get old in the tooth. But at the time, it was a single user name, single password that allowed for access to things like email platform, data storage, your map drives, your workstations, all the things. But the problem with it is that it's really bound to the domain itself. And in order to kind of break away or maybe even allow external access into the environment from, say, like partners and other vendors, what would typically happen is you'd have to create maybe a resource domain or maybe another forest located in a demilitarized zone or your DMZ. And while all this worked, it was pretty tough to set up and organize and especially maintain. And so when Josh went through the episode 1, he was also talking about all of the legacy areas of a workplace that are still around today, such as, there might be on-premise Exchange server, there might be a group-wise server for messaging. You might be using network attached storage and file servers and so forth. And you can see in this list, there's a legacy workplace, but there's a matching modern workplace area where these things can move to. And so we were talking about, prioritizing when you're thinking about moving to a modern workplace. First off, the idea is that we want to make it easy for the users. We want to make it, more productive, and we want to make it more secure. And it was important to maybe prioritize what we're moving first. In this sense, we're going to be covering Azure Active Directory. That's going to be the first workload that really kind of makes sense and really lays down the foundation for all the rest to be able to move. Let's dig into it a little further here then. First off, what is Azure Active Directory? Well, It can be defined as the current evolution of identity and access management. And I'm underlining those because it sounds kind of like an oxymoron, but the current evolution really means that Azure Active Directory is a platform that is used by hundreds of thousands of customers today. It's a standard, but it's continuing to evolve. Microsoft is pouring, hundreds of thousands, even billions of dollars into making sure that Azure Active Directory keeps improving, that it makes it more productive, and that it's more secure. An example of this can be found by going to Roadmap, and let me show you what I mean here. I'm going to flip over to a screen real quick, and we'll go ahead and launch what we consider Roadmap. And you can Google this, you can Bing it, but the Microsoft 365 Roadmap is there so you can keep on top of what the developments are, what's in development, what is rolling out, and what is being launched. And as you can see, there's a lot of different areas of Microsoft 365. But here in particular, we can filter exactly on Azure Active Directory to see what's in development here. And as you can see, there's quite a bit. Cross-tenant synchronization, tenant creation lockdowns. There's a lot of really great stuff that's coming out and being released here. So that is what is meant by the fact that it's constantly evolving. Now, for you history buffs out there who've been administering Active Directory for a long time, it around the turn of the millennium, it gave organizations that single identity per user to access all of the platforms across the organization. But Azure AD takes it to the next level, and it really is an identity as a service solution. And not only does it allow you access to your on-premise areas, but also to cloud applications. So it really ties identities together for all of your productivity, application needs, and so forth. As a solutions architect, we're constantly asked questions, especially for those who really aren't sure if they should start the move yet. So what are the common pain points that Azure AD addresses? Well, first of all, if you're looking to reduce infrastructure, that is first and foremost. I mean, this allows you to start reducing the domain controller footprint within the organization and even maybe move to a cloud only model where you can actually decommission Active Directory altogether. Now, while that requires a lot of careful planning and dependencies, the reality is that that truly could happen. We're going to talk about this a little bit further into this presentation. Another area that this addresses is the fact that in 2023 now, we see a lot of people coming back into the office within the trusted network organization. And at the same time, we still have a lot of remote workers as well. So it's becoming even more decentralized than ever before. So Azure AD creates that access to applications from anywhere and anytime. And I'm underlining those because those are a very careful thing to say. Some organizations don't want you to have access anywhere and anytime. And we're going to talk about the controls that you can put in place to help, really give the organization a much more focused and secure approach. At the same time, these are things that your organization can use to manage. The tools that come with Azure AD, it truly is a single pane of glass. It's browser-based. You can open up a browser and be able to manage users and groups and devices. And this really helps drive down the support costs of getting expensive tools and interfaces to be able to do really the same thing. And finally, organizations need to constantly stay ahead of those zero-day attacks, account compromise, lateral account movement. These are all things that we need to be aware of. And Azure AD is phenomenal at even with the default settings by providing some very good security in place. So how do we plan for identity and access management in a modern workplace? But before we do that, I'm going to open this up to the first poll question. And that poll question is, where are you in your journey in moving to a modern workplace? And really the audience will be that, you might be just starting your journey. Maybe you're a new company that is looking to achieve AD in the cloud, or maybe you've been around a long time and you're administering Active Directory and maybe not trusting the cloud as much. I'd like to know where you are in your journey. With that said, I'm going to move on while you're completing the poll there. And an important thing to first of all recognize in identities is, what is an identity? And long ago, the days were that an identity was your username and password, and that was pretty much it. Nowadays, we really need to take into consideration various conditions that help define an identity. For example, what are we logging in with? Who are we? Are you an employee? Are you a partner? Are you a vendor? What type of device are you using to get into the environment? Where are you located? And what type of application are you using? Because that helps define the application methods. Now, once we define these conditions, we put Azure AD to work. Let's use Azure AD to our benefit to provide that machine learning, and along with policies that we create internally, but also with real-time evaluation engines with things like Microsoft Defender, we're going to create what's known as a session risk. That session risk is going to be either good, it's going to be risky, and with our effective policy, this is where we could start implementing those controls. For example, should we allow access from maybe an untrusted internet location? Should we limit access? Should we require MFA or force a password reset? And especially for those applications, which we're going to get into a little bit soon here, those authentication methods, if they're sending authentication via clear text, my take is that we should block it altogether. That is not a secure way. So all of these controls can happen through what we call conditional access, and this is what helps define an identity. So just to summarize, we know who, what, where, how that user is logging in, and we can answer the question, why does the user need to log in? We can even take it a bit further by applying business justifications and overrides that a user can put in that justification and allow an administrator to either approve or deny the request. We can also answer, when does the user need access to the environment, by applying time-based restrictions. Or if you're an administrator and you need to get in and do some work, we can implement privileged identity management, which allows you time-based access to be able to manage and administer a certain type of environment or application. So overall, when we're planning for identity and access management, these are the main components we want to talk about. We want to make sure there's a good plan for multi-factor authentication. And when it's paired with this conditional access, this is a best practice. Another feature we want to take into consideration and select is the type of modern authentication that's going to be used. This is going to help prevent, those clear text authentications from happening. We want to make it productive at the same time. We want to make users to give their lives a little bit more, you know, a little bit easier to be able to access multiple applications using their identity. Now, that can't really be done until we have a good multi-factor authentication and a good modern authentication in place. At the same time, let's leverage Azure Active Directory identities to be able to get into on-premises applications. And privileged identity management, as I mentioned, gives you that just-in-time access, or just enough access to be able to do what needs to be done with the environment. So a lot of controls, and these are really the foundations that need to go into planning identity and access management in a modern workplace. So the types of Azure AD synchronization models. Now, what I'm going to get into here is, you might already be, synchronizing identities to Azure AD, or you might be just getting started here. Either way, we're going to cover all of the bases. Now, there are different kinds of synchronization models when it comes to identities. The first one is really actually not a synchronization model, but it's really cloud only. And then there's two other synchronization models known as managed and federated. Let's go through each of these a little bit more closely. So Azure AD Cloud only identities. I mean, very easy to set up. Uh, if you're establishing a Microsoft 365 tenant for the first time, you're already using Azure Active Directory. And the benefits of this is pretty astounding. I mean, administration is flexible because you're using the browser-based Windows to help manage users, groups, devices. It's secure, although with additional policies and conditional access, we can get onboarded with additional security. It's ready to go, and it's scalable. And when you bring your actual domain over, your own custom domain, you can support up to 300,000 objects. So it's quite scalable there, even with a cloud-only identity. Now, the only drawbacks with this model is that if you are already using some type of Active Directory and users are logging into a domain, there really isn't any synchronization and there's no real single sign-on. And as you grow, it's going to be harder to maintain password policies and overall usage is just going to be that much more difficult. So why not go to the next step, which is to synchronize identities in a managed mode. And what I mean by that is Azure AD Connect, as you can see there, or Azure AD Cloud Sync, which is Azure AD Connect's little brother. It's going to help synchronize users and passwords to Azure AD. Now, the benefits of this are that this allows for a better centralized administration. This also starts you on the path of single sign-on. This kind of model is relatively easy to set up. As I mentioned, it's involving installing the Azure AD Connect or Cloud Sync, and it's scalable. And the nice thing about this, we can choose whether you want Microsoft to authenticate your users, or if you are not quite trusting yet into Microsoft, you can use what's known as the pass-through authentication agent, which allows your domain controllers to do the authentication and processing of the authentication tokens. With that said, there's a lot of other features, such as self-service password reset, which is available to make life a little bit easier for your users to manage their identities. The only drawbacks with this is that still to this day, synchronization is a one-way road. Now, there are definitely exceptions. There are certain attributes that write back from cloud to on-premise. But for the most part, whenever you're managing identities in this mode, everything really needs to happen from on-premises Active Directory. And this is especially true, for example, with Exchange. We need to extend the Active Directory schema to synchronize attributes. We also need to apply additional management tools on premise to be able to manage those objects, such as users and their mailbox types and other things. But overall, this is what's considered a managed identity. The other type of synchronized identity is known as federated. And for those of you who might remember, ADFS is a type of federated identity. And there's those third-party tools such as Okta, OneLogin, Ping Identity. These things are third-party tools that allow for really at times some richer single sign-on capabilities. They do a really good job at focusing on the task and identities and single sign-on. Now, the nice thing about federated identities is that we can also incorporate a fallback plan if needed. If you've been in the industry long enough, you know that if problems happen with ADFS, things can go wrong. Or if the service for your third-party provider experience any kind of outages, things can go wrong. So we can incorporate password hash synchronization as a fallback option and perhaps move back to managed identities to be able to recover and get back to speed until the service is back up and available. Now, the drawbacks with this is ADFS is a Microsoft solution. It provides, some really great and quick authentication and single sign-on, but you got to plan for lots of redundancy. You got to incorporate load balancers, networking, multiple servers and farms, and it can be quite pricey just to, develop and design and sustain the ADFS environment. Now, in the more modern workplace, third-party federation products are a really good solution, but also they carry on an operational expense that might be above and beyond what your budget might allow. So those are the three types of synchronization. We're just going to go through this one more time, which is cloud only, managed, and federated. And between the three, if you want to move from cloud only to managed or managed to federated, or even go back all the way to cloud only, these are definite realities that can happen. So definitely are some traversals that can happen between these synchronization models. Now on to the next topic, which is single sign-on. So now that we talked about, overall conditional access, what an identity is, and we talked about synchronization of identities or cloud only, let's talk about single sign-on. But again, I'm going to pause here for another poll, and I'd like to know how you're logging on to your organization today. Some organizations are, you know, they use separate usernames and passwords for every, single application or resource that needs to happen. Some organizations like to try to match the usernames and passwords as closely as possible, and some organizations are already using some form of single sign-on. I'd like to know where you stand today. Now, as you're completing the poll there, I'll move on, and I'm going to show you what it looks like in the day of a life of a user without single sign-on. A user is going to sign in the morning to their Office suite, Microsoft 365 service, and then there has to be some type of perhaps a electronic signature needs to happen on a contract. So let's open up Adobe with a second username and password. The actual document might be living in Box, and we have another username and password to sign into. And now we got to keep track of our time. So let's go into Workday, and finally, let's do a Zoom call to talk with our customer, which will require yet another username and password. Now, you can see in the pattern here, and in an environment as small as this, it might not be a big deal. But as you grow, you can see how painful it's going to be to have to manage multiple passwords. As opposed to single sign-on, the user will sign in once and get access to all the applications that are part of that single sign-on initiative. The effectiveness can really be measured, and it was measured actually in 2019 by the National Institute of Health. They conducted a study across 19 hospitals within a healthcare system, and they wanted to see the benefits of single sign-on before it was implemented and after it was implemented. Now, as you can imagine, in a hospital system, you have doctors, you have nurses, you have clinicians that are moving from room to room, and there's workstations, maybe at a nursing station, maybe in a doctor's office or in a patient room. What they found out was that as they're moving around the environment and they start their shift, the first logon performance after single sign-on implementation shot up by 15%. Now, 15% is nothing that I would really write home about, but here's where the impact really was. The relogon performance improvement shot up by 70%. So that means as they were working through their shifts, they were coming back to their workstations, they were signing back in, and that connectivity was very quick for them to be able to do their job. What this amounted to was annual time savings of almost 50,000 hours. That was over 4,000 hospital shifts in a year. And financially, this amounted to over $3 million annually by just implementing something as fairly as simple as single sign-on. So you can see the impact that this has made financially and time savings and so forth. The link is above here in blue in case you want to jot it down or take a screenshot of it. Very interesting study they did. So we can see what the obvious benefits of single sign-on are, that you don't have to memorize multiple passwords, you don't have to reset multiple passwords. It's easy to grow into your application base. If you have other applications like Box or Concur or Salesforce, start introducing those into single sign-on, and you're going to see how much easier it's going to be for authentication. This also reduces calls to the help desk because it allows more for a self-service model for users. Now, the big question is that we get asked quite often is really how secure is single sign-on? I mean, aren't we putting all our eggs in one basket? Well, to answer that, we could argue that efficiency, such as something like single sign-on, equals improved security. Because what happens is if you need to proactively reset a password, this is going to stream that password change across all applications. Whenever we go in and implement single sign-on, we really want to plan for making sure those passwords are longer and more complex as opposed to prior. We don't want weak passwords here at all. So we want to perform a practice of longer and more complex passwords. We also need to make sure we tie in a good multi-factor authentication practice with this to help protect those identities. So the question really is now, do we really need to use passwords? And to answer that is that, been about passwords for quite some time. Passwords will be here, no doubt about it. And to kind of help tackle that, Azure AD has a built-in password protection. And let me show you what that looks like. The password protection not only extends from, you cloud-based Azure AD identities, but also if you're using Active Directory on premises, password protection includes agents to help protect you. This can all be found in the authentication management of the portal. And let me show you where that is. I'll flip over to an example here. And let me move over to my next there. And we're going to move into the entra.microsoft.com. Entra Admin Center, that's the new admin center where you can centralize your administration. And we're going to dive over to Protect and Secure and Authentication Methods under Azure Active Directory. And from here, you can see there's password protection. Let's go ahead and click on that. Now from here, you can see there are some defaults. There's custom smart lockout, lockout thresholds. Even if you want to put in your custom banned password list, we can do that. Let me show you a little bit closer how this works here. So when we click on password protection, this custom smart lockout, you might be familiar with it already. Active Directory Federation services include custom smart lockout mechanisms, but we can define the lockout threshold and the duration of that lockout. And as I mentioned, we can set up a custom banned password list. And if you need to extend this to Active Directory on premise, this is where we do it. There are agents that get installed in the Active Directory environment to allow to fortify the passwords. And if it shows up that you've got some weak passwords, it's going to know about it and it's going to go through some policies to help users reestablish a better password practice. So pretty cool stuff in terms of password protection. And that's how this achieves this kind of age-old password issue. Now, going back to should we really need to use passwords? I'm hate to say it, but I'm not afraid to expose my password that I've used for several years here. And I thought I was being pretty clever by adding an uppercase and lowercase letters and throwing in some numbers there. And I mean, no one would guess this, correct? I did a little bit more digging around and I wanted to see for myself, how people do crack into passwords. So let me go ahead and show you an example here. I downloaded a brute force password attack list, and you can download a list from really any cybersecurity tool out there. This was done from a penetration testing, and this has close to 1 million passwords in the list. And that's just tip of the iceberg considering password lists and password harvesting. I wanted to see if my password was actually in here, and pretty much right in the middle of the file, there it was. So I know that right away, this password probably has been used for quite some several years now and kind of gives me a little bit more eye-opening experience. And that's why we really need to extend the length of the passwords and make it more complex. Now, as you can imagine, passwords have become kind of a nightmare. And don't take my word for it. Take the word from the late Fernando Corbato. He was the inventor of the password system. At the time, early 60s, he was developing a computer time sharing system that allowed for multiple users to use the same computer. And it was very convenient in the day to establish some passwords or password systems to make users, be able to see the data that they're working on. But over the years, he said, unfortunately, it's become kind of a nightmare with the World Wide Web. And just to paraphrase, I mean, he mentioned you either need to maintain a crib sheet or you have to use some kind of password manager. Now, nothing against password managers. There's a lot of great products out there to help manage passwords. But the problem with it is as your corporation is growing, it really becomes much more of a nuisance. So, what can we do to kind of battle the concept of passwords here? Azure AD. It has what's known as passwordless solutions. Here are a few of them. Now, when I talk about password solutions, we're really talking about different factors of authentication. There's phishing resistant multi-factor authentication, and this comes in the flavors of Windows Hello for Business, which uses your biometric facial features to be able to provide authentication. If you want to take it a next step, there's FIDO2 security keys, which can be utilized to encrypt your session between your identity and the resources you're accessing there. And there's certificate-based authentication. So an organization can push out a highly secured certificate to devices to allow that so the organization can trust your device and therefore trust your identity. When you pair this along with passwordless multi-factor authentication, such as Microsoft Authenticator, you have a really good solution going forward and going toward passwordless solutions. Let's take a closer look at this in practice. All right. So there's a thing called authentication strengths. And again, we're going to move into the entra.microsoft.com portal, click on Active Directory, go to Protect and Secure, and click on Authentication Methods. Authentication strengths is right there. And right away, you can see some built-in passwordless solutions such as passwordless MFA and phishing resistant MFA. Now, the nice thing about authentication methods is that we don't have to stick to what's built in. We can actually make our own passwordless authentication solution. So let's go ahead and create a new authentication strength. We'll give it a name and a description. And as we scroll down, we're going to be able to select those passwordless multi-factor authentication methods to allow users to leverage during our conditional access policies. So I threw in this case, multi-factor authentication using Microsoft Authenticator, SMS, and Windows Hello for Business. These are things that a user can enroll in when they start signing in to their services, and we can apply that to our conditional policies as required. And there we go. We've got our custom corp auth strength. So you can see how easy it is to maybe go into a direction of passwordless solutions. So just to summarize, authentication strengths are right here, where we have Microsoft Authentication and then passwordless solutions here. Very cool stuff that Azure AD provides. Now in this next area, we're going to move from, I should say, authentication strengths to authentication methods. What I mean by that is how are we logging in and how does the application behave in terms of logging in and authenticating? Well, not all applications within single sign-on are created equal. We have cloud applications and we have on-premises applications. The cloud applications are performed by authenticating via modern ways of authentication, such as OpenID Connect, OAuth, and SAML is considered a form of modern authentication, although it's been around a long, long time. But these are really the preferable ways of authenticating to cloud applications. There's other ways as well. We can go password-based if we want. We can also link it to other authentication providers, such as Okta, OneLogin. Or if that application really is getting kind of old and doesn't support any kind of single sign-on, just disable SSO or start investigating other applications that can take its place. For on-premise applications, we have SAML, we have integrated Windows authentication, we have header-based, which is a browser-based or considered a reverse proxy, and we can also link this to other forms of authentication. Now, I realize some of these these terms might be a little bit confusing or new to you. All these are different types of authentication methods, and some are more modern than others. And when we are selecting the way to authenticate, we want to kind of lean towards the ones that are more modern for us. Let's take a look how we do that. This flowchart, I know it might be kind of hard to read. I'm going to dive into it a little bit easier, but this helps pave the way of deciding which type of authentication model to choose when you are setting up your application for single sign-on. Let's go through this in practice and I'll show you what I mean. Again, going back to the entra.microsoft.com, what we're going to do here is we're going to move into Azure Active Directory and applications. And within enterprise applications, we're going to select an application to include in single sign-on. Now, you can see there's a bunch here that might be available and ready to set up, but if not, you can always search for that application in the Azure AD gallery. So let's go ahead and let's create a new Azure AD application. And as you can see, there's a ton of them. And one thing I wanted to point out here, really small icons, but I'm going to zoom into it and I'm going to show you if the application is single sign-on ready or auto provisioning ready. So that's what those two little icons next to the application designate. Let's go ahead and go through. We're going to click on Salesforce and we'll include that as our application of choice. And right away, we can see that it supports password-based, it supports SAML-based, and linked single sign-on. It also has auto provisioning, by the way. Let's go ahead and create it. And once it's created, there's a few steps to do, such as making sure you have the users and groups established. But one of the next steps is performing the single sign-on configuration. So let's go ahead in there. And you'll see right here, these are the choices we have: SAML, password-based, linked. I'm going to choose SAML because that to me is a more modern way of authenticating. So as you can see, it's fairly easy step by step on how to set up SAML authentication with Salesforce. And if we get stuck, we can always click on the configuration guide, which really gives us that close tutorial and guidance on how to set it up properly. So as you can see, going back to the context of even, single sign-on, as easy as it is to set up, it provides a lot of benefits here. Zooming into that flow chart, you can see kind of where we start by if you're deploying a modern application or you're developing a modern application, and if it supports OpenID and OAuth, use it. If it doesn't quite support OpenID or OAuth, and it's a cloud application, choose SAML. These are really the priorities of which you should be thinking of when you're deploying applications and clicking on those choices. Other types of authentication methods approach the on-premise method where there's SAML integration, integrated Windows authentication, header-based, and so forth. So this really helps you make that decision of which to prioritize. Well, we're going to be wrapping this up, but first we have our final poll question. And what I'd like to know is now that you've been introduced to Azure AD, single sign-on, and the ways that we can secure it, how has your stance changed on Modern Workplace? Perhaps you're still kind of struggling for the concept of moving to the cloud, or perhaps you're, okay, I'm trusting it a little bit more now, or maybe, hey, we've been using this for some time now and it's awesome. So let us know how things go there. And as I wrap things up here, we're going to just cover and recap what we talked about in the first episode, in this episode, and to kind of cover all the bases there. So as we know, start with establishing an Azure AD tenant. That's going to give you Azure AD right from the get-go. At the same time, establishing a Microsoft 365 tenant is really one and the same thing. Now, if you are choosing cloud only, that's great. Definitely encourage you to move into that fashion. But if you're still having reliance on Active Directory, create a synchronization methodology. You can implement directory synchronization by incorporating Azure AD Connect or Azure AD Cloud Sync. This will help establish your identities and synchronize those to the Azure AD tenant. This allows and paves the way then to start migrating the legacy workloads to the modern workloads. So you can start with Exchange or maybe your file shares moving to SharePoint and Teams and OneDrive and so forth. Even devices definitely have their home in Azure Active Directory. Add other applications to make that single sign-on and make your users a lot more productive and not spend as much time, logging into every single application that they need to for their work. And finally, don't forget to secure it with multi-factor authentication. And there's password-based, but there's also passwordless-based, which you might want to consider in the future. And overall, understanding your readiness, again, if you're not sure where to start, we always encourage you to take a look at the m365maps.com. And we can't do this without giving credit to Aaron Dinich, who is always phenomenal in giving us some really great licensing maps. Licensing is really going to kind of dictate what you would have access to. For example, in Azure AD, there's always the basic, which doesn't cost you anything. But if you want to move into Azure AD Premium, there's a lot to be said and a lot of value that we just covered in this alone that gives you a lot more productivity and security. So dive into those maps and see where you are with your licensing. Also, you might not want to, synchronize or establish all your users in Azure AD. You can do this by creating filters or just establishing those users in the cloud first to, you know, get your feet wet into it, see how it works, see how it behaves. Now, we didn't cover and go deep into this area, but external users and partners and vendors are definitely some areas we do want to cover in the future here. Now, there are some solutions with Azure AD. You can invite users as guests, or you can implement a solution called Azure B2B, which is really a partner-based and a vendor-based. And if you have a long-term partnership with other organizations, even from other identity providers, we can establish some really good single sign-on capabilities there. Understanding your security, compliance, and governance requirements is pretty crucial here before you really dive into Azure AD. Look for your dependencies. As I mentioned, Active Directory, it might be a big dependency if you're looking to go cloud only. See what's still dependent on Active Directory before making that full dive into cloud only, or establish an easier method and ease into it by establishing synchronization. We have to create the foundation being, making sure you have the proper identities established, your security and compliance governance established, and all those other things. And at times when we're implementing modern workplace, sometimes there's going to be a change that the user is going to notice. Now, hopefully this change is something easier for them, but at the same time, it's going to be something different. So adoption and change management is always important to ease users into change and getting them ready. Now, at Rackspace, as a solutions architect here, we can help you in many ways. We have professional services if you're looking to do migrations. We have what's known as elastic engineering, which is really to help you maintain and sustain and enable and enhance your Microsoft 365 presence. And we have the licensing expertise that goes along with all of that. So I thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned. This was episode 2, but we're going to have episode 3 coming up shortly in the next month. And we're going to do some deeper dives into the modern workplace technologies that we can move to. Now, if you have any questions or you want to get a little bit more information, we have a link here. If you're using a desktop and you have your phone handy, you can take a snapshot of the QR code or just jot down the link to go to a questionnaire. And the questionnaire will, kind of go through what your goals are and things like that. We don't share any of the information externally, and we hope you can participate in that to really help you out. So again, much appreciated, and look forward to the next episodes forthcoming.